mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortune he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاش الجيل الصاعد، جيل من شعب مجاهد، عاش يبني ويجاهد، عاش بكفاحه الخالد، عاش يبني ويجاهد، عاش بكفاحه الخالد، راجل واحد مبدأ واحد،
عاش جيل ثورتنا،
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد حرار. عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد حرار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية،
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية
خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجند العربي عاش.
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الثورة عاش.
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروي حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان، يروي حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخل طالع منها لهب النور والنار. عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار، فيها مداخل طالع منها لهب النور والنار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرناه. حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى، والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرناه. قولوا معايا حيوا معايا
عاش عاش العامل عاش.
عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح، عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
وسمعنا بيقولها هوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار، يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجيل الصاعد عاش.
عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان، عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان، عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. أمان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ردينا عليك يا جمال وايدينا في ايديك يا جمال، وطلعنا معاك يا جمال نبني وياك يا جمال. ردينا عليك
يا جمال
وايدينا في ايديك
يا جمال،
وطلعنا معاك
يا جمال
نبني وياك يا جمال. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش عبد الناصر عاش.
Утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжается бой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
И звон продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
everybody, and welcome to the live stream of The World Tonight for this evening of the 13th of January 2024. And tonight the main focus is going to be on the recent events that have taken place in Ecuador and how this fits into a broader imperialist agenda in the Southern American nations. But before we get to that, I want to mention some events that have occurred today in my own nation of perfidious Albion, which is, of course, that if you've been following the Telegram group that I run, you'll know that several of my comrades from the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, have apparently been arrested today in London. They were attending the large-scale Palestinian solidarity demonstration. Apparently they have been arrested for handing out leaflets that have "Victory to the Resistance" as the main title of said leaflet. And of course the officers who have carried out this arrest are alleging that this is terrorism somehow. Now, I want to mention that the terrorism laws in Britain, as they are in the United States, as they are in France and Germany and just about every imperialist nation, these are laws which define terrorism as basically anything that the state wants to define it as. Specifically, it makes it illegal to support national liberation movements if the government has decided that these are so-called terrorist organizations. And I'm not surprised that this has happened, because this is the reason why over 20 years ago they started making the definition of terrorism as broad as they possibly could. And what's been built up over the last 25 years really is a police state apparatus that most of the time, to most people, will not be visible. When it was being used on isolated groups of stitched up Muslim men 20 years ago, most people in Britain didn't notice and didn't care, and only a few of us noticed. But the reason why this definition of terrorism again is so broad, the reason why they have a secret police mechanism and a state informant mechanism called Prevent, which is even isolated and sought to psychologically, I would say, intimidate and psychologically break children as young as 11 or 12 sometimes for expressing terrorist sympathies, meaning, of course, expressing solidarity with the Palestinian struggle or any other liberation struggle that the British imperialist government has deemed to be unacceptable, which is pretty much all of them. So what do you actually have? If you examine the laws of Britain or the United States or any nation within the US imperialist bloc, you'll find a plethora of laws and powers that the state has, that the police have, that the intelligence agencies have, that the secret police agencies have, and that the various other agencies which don't even have a name have, or a name that is unknown to us. They have constructed a system which is quite terrifying to behold when you actually examine it, because it is the nightmarish system that they all told us for so many years, all the way through the Cold War, was what communism was. But of course that was always a lie. This is a system which has been built and designed, and its whole purpose is to smash the working class. That's what it's for. It's not for arresting members of Al-Qaeda, because Al-Qaeda largely it works for the US imperialists, and possibly always did. It's not for ISIS. It's not for, who, by the way, were aided in recruiting people by British intelligence. It's for working class radicals. That's who it's always been for. That's who the British state targets the most of its resources at smashing whenever a working class radical movement emerges. Whenever the class consciousness of the proletariat in any country, but particularly in the imperialist sphere, whenever that increases to the point where the state regards it as a threat, then the hammer comes down, just as it did in the latest laws. There's a reason why they're passing more anti-trade union laws. There's a reason why they're arresting people for handing out a leaflet. There's a reason why they don't arrest certain Trotskyite groups, of whom more later. There's a reason why all this happens, and it is because, of course, the authority of the state, of the capitalist state, in our case the British capitalist state, is draining away, and they know it. And all they have left now is repression. They don't have the ability anymore to tell people that some sort of glorious future is just around the corner if they just keep their nose clean and work hard, which is the sort of the Thatcher to Blair era messaging. Since 2008, the only thing that they've had to offer is that they will keep things stable for enough people to continue profiting from the system, just about. So that for enough of the petty bourgeoisie that they will continue to just about continue to keep their heads above water. And that is the only message that they have. That they will keep things together, and unless you vote for one of the establishment parties, then everything will collapse into chaos and disorder, which is what we're going to actually come to later with Ecuador. They don't have anything positive to say. They don't have anything positive to offer the working class, of course. The only thing they have to offer is repression and the continual stoking of divisions within the working class. If you go back and read Marx and read about his theories of crisis and his building of his own theory of revolution, which of course Lenin, Stalin, Mao, Kim Il-sung and others built on, you start to see how the working class has to go through a long struggle of bringing about unity within its ranks. And this struggle, of course, is intense, it is difficult, because since the very beginning, the capitalists have sought to divide the proletariat by religion, by nationality, by racial classification, by cultural dividing issues, by grade of job, by wage scale, and a myriad of other things, because they know, or at least the more aware of the ruling class and their servants in the state know very well, that if the working class was to get over these divisions for a sustained period of time and was to raise itself to becoming at least a class for itself, and then of course enough of them become revolutionaries, but if that process were to occur, then the system would be in extremely large amount of trouble. And that's why they are working so hard at building a police state. And they have been doing for, again, it's been going on for a quarter of a century. Longer if you, in Britain, count the period where they were passing various laws against Irish republicanism back in the 70s and the 80s. But certainly it has intensified since the late 1990s. The first Anti-Terrorism Act was passed in 1999 in Britain by the Blair government, before 9/11, by the way. So this is where we're going. There's now laws in place in Britain which allow the undercover operatives of the intelligence services and the police to commit murder, commit sexual assaults, commit any kind of base and criminal act that they need to on the grounds of defending state security. That's now the law of the land. Now, those of us who have read our history know that representatives of the British Secret Services have always done that, but they at least pretended that they were abiding by some kind of liberal concept of the rule of law, and that there were some barriers that they would not cross, some lines that they would not cross. Well, that's all going away now. And this is why it's important to have an understanding of how the decay in imperialism and how the decay and rotting away of the productive forces that decaying monopoly capitalism brings about manifests itself in various different phenomenon inside the superstructure. So, for instance, many, what I would call, or not many, but a few people who I've known over the last 20 years have been what you would call principled liberals, which is these are people who honestly do believe that the state could be made into some sort of neutral force, that the rule of law under capitalism can be attained and it can be a great leveler of the playing field, that a civil order can be defended by rational lawmaking, that the police can be retooled and remade in the image of a societal instrument that is for the good, and all those type of beliefs that you would associate with the liberals who take the philosophies of people like John Stuart Mill seriously. And they're always baffled by the authoritarian turn, as they call it. Well, why is the government getting so authoritarian? Why have there been so many so-called anti-terrorism laws passed? Why do more and more of them get passed every year? Why do more and more powers get given to the secret police agencies, the intelligence agencies, all the different organs of repression? And the answer is, of course, that this is all a response to a deep and underlying crisis, which again has different ways of manifesting itself inside a state, or inside the state and the other superstructures of capitalist society. The decay and the decline has been there running under the surface for many, many years. To go back to discussions that have been had about the rate of profit, for instance, if you analyze the theories regarding the rate of profit being central to a Marxist conception of crisis, in the work of people like the Michael Roberts, the economist who runs the Next Recession blog, or Andrew Kleinman, who wrote several books on the centrality, as he sees it, of the declining rate of profit to Marxist theory of crisis. Well, what they argue, and I think there's a lot of validity in this. I think they go a little bit too far in centering the rate of profit declining as like the only thing they focus on, but I think the focus on it in their academic work does give a lot of good insight into the importance of the theory. But the thing I'm going to note from their work is one statistic, which is that the recovery, so-called, the neoliberal boom, as they call it — I don't like the term neoliberal — but the post-79 to 82 recession boom in the United States and in Britain in particular doesn't recover the rate of profit to anything like what it was in the post-World War II boom. So what you have is a recovery that, of course, makes a lot of money for a tiny percentage of the population, i.e. the capitalist class, but you have a lot of elastic bands being deployed by the capitalist class to bind things together again. And the stretch on these things is slowly giving out because the rate of profit did not recover. They tried to maintain a consumer society by both hyper-exploiting labor more, so productivity of labor goes up, but real wages stagnate in Britain and the United States. You have, therefore, to continue with the consumer economy, you have to get cheaper commodities from other areas of the world where labor can be subject to even greater exploitation. In the 90s and early 2000s, this was China. Then it starts to move to places like Indonesia, Vietnam, Cambodia, and other places. The point being that to sustain all of the different methods they used, partially to restore profitability, but also to act as methods of societal control. Remember what I said about divisions in the working class? Well, consumerism is a way of dividing the working class, getting people to fetishize consumerism, and the purchase of commodities is a way of dividing people. It's a way of increasing alienation and atomization. And therefore, the continuation of the consumerist society is important, not just on the profit level, but also on the societal level, and in the way in which you can use it to, again, divide and subdivide layers of the working class. So, but as I've said before, every time the bourgeois think that they've solved a problem by pursuing a certain tactic, it only opens up another problem. If you're going to try and hold down wages in America or Britain, which they have done for many, many years, on the average real wages in terms of what your wages can buy you. But you also want to continue consumerism. Therefore, you need to extend credit. Therefore, you also want to extend credit because you want to create you need to create a house price boom. It's because that's a great center of profit, and therefore you expand you create more credit. This gives a temporary boost, but then it creates another problem. And so you can see that what happened since the 70s, actually earlier, since the 60s, has been almost 60 years now of the capitalist classes in Britain and the United States and in the major European countries of throwing one thing after the other up to delay the crisis, like smashing the unions and suppressing the militant sections of the working class. That helps them get through another couple of decades in the 80s and the 90s. Expanding credit further and cutting taxes in the United States and under George W. Bush helps get through a few more years up to 2007. Since then, though, we've been in a prolonged depression. And so this comes back to the point about how long-term crises manifest themselves through the various different societal superstructures, principally the state, but in other areas as well. Also, culture and the culture industry is part of the superstructure. So this long-term crisis that imperialism has been going through manifests itself, of course, even before the spectacular media event of 9/11. It manifests itself through an growing crisis of legitimacy that the state starts to respond to by just looking to clamp down. You've got other influences in there as well, like the number of senior people in the civil service who are, of course, by dint of their position as very well-paid representatives of the bourgeoisie, are all, of course, convinced by end-of-history theory, whether they understand it or not. They're all, of course, convinced that there can be no possible alternative to the current system, and therefore not only is there no possible alternative to the current system, but anybody who proposes one must be a criminal or a lunatic or both. And therefore, criminalizing everybody who puts forward any kind of alternative, and especially if they're doing it in a class-based fashion or anti-imperialist fashion, that's unacceptable to the point of where it has to be immediately criminalized. This is the way in which it has been going for many, many years, and the root of it is the long-term underlying crisis of imperialism, the crisis of profitability, the crisis of overproduction as well. And so this is the way in which this is what has led us to this point. It is why the arrest of the comrades on the demonstration today is only an indication that the state is, of course, starting to worry in more and more dramatic ways. It's not just here, of course, that you can see all of the states in Europe starting to react in the same way. Just look at how Macron dealt with the Yellow Vest movement. Extreme amounts of state repression and violence and the murder of quite a number of people by the French cops. And of course, for many of us who participate in various protest movements and demonstrations, when these are either battered into submission or led down a blind alley by foolish opportunist leaders or leaders who are agents of the state in some cases, it can be tempting to regard this as a waste of time. It's done nothing, but nothing ever fails to leave its mark, or its mark upon society, its mark upon individuals. People might fall into cynicism. They might go backwards in their politics. But the massive movements against, for instance, the British state in the lead up to the Iraq War, they failed to prevent the Iraq War due to appalling leadership. But the effect that they did have, even if they were limited in what they did, was to essentially destroy the credibility of a certain Mr. Sir Anthony Charles Linton Blair, known by his crime name as Tony Blair. And it destroyed this man who was a favourite of the ruling class. It made him become just too toxic a figure. And the ruling class is still very angry about that. And so these movements, like the Yellow Vests, that got battered into the ground by the French state due to, again, a leadership which was confused and unclear about the way forward. They still expected the French state to respond ultimately to their demands. And of course it didn't. It just responded with violence. What we're witnessing overall here is the move from the state, and to draw on something Antonio Gramsci said, relying on, or being able to rely on, persuasion via ideological means, to just using brute force. And that, of course, is, again, state solves, let's use the example of France. The state solves a problem of the Yellow Vests by literally battering that movement into the ground, killing people, beating people up, locking people up, mass arrests, breaks that movement in the end. Of course, but the forces unleashed by it don't go away, nor does the damage done to the legitimacy of the French state by the way it reacted to that. That people aren't going to forget it, no matter what Macron says or does, and no matter which change of personnel occurs in the hierarchy of the French state. So for bourgeois states in the imperialist world that have sold themselves to their own population and to the wider world for many years as being the idea of that they are governing by consent, that these are democracies, useless, pointless term, but this is the selling that they give, this is the advertising that they engage in. When everybody internally sees that this is how the state behaves, when it's opened up to people, to the working class, that no, there is no policing by consent, there is no democratic order here, you have no real rights under this system. If the state chooses to imprison you and destroy your entire life, they can do so, unless, of course, enough opposition can be mobilized amongst the working class to stop it in its tracks. The thing is, though, they can destroy an individual, they can bury a man like Julian Assange in prison for 5 years, 10 years, forever, if they can get away with it. So it is possible for them to do all these things. But again, keep this in mind. Every move they are making only undermines their own authority. And their own authority is draining away. And the social base they represent, of course, they truly represent, is tiny. And they know that, which is why they need to keep at least a good section of the petty bourgeois on their side, and a section of the working class at least consenting tacitly behind them as well. That working class element will drain away. Large elements of the petty bourgeois are already becoming more and more discontented. We saw that with the farmers' protest the other day in Germany. It's happening all over the place. And so what you are starting to see is a mounting crisis, which the state will respond to by acts like this, by more and more nakedly political acts of repression. But of course, more and more people aren't going to believe it anymore, as it becomes absolutely clear that the people in charge of the state have absolutely no solutions. And so this is where we are. So I would, if any of the comrades who got arrested today happen to watch or listen to this in the future, I would say solidarity, of course, but also to bear in mind that what we're witnessing is the British state starting to get more and more desperate. Its legitimacy draining. It's flailing around and trying to intimidate people in our party, because there has been a recognition by someone in the British state machine. It's not rank and file coppers making these decisions to arrest our comrades. It's somebody in the hierarchy of the British state, maybe in the Home Office, maybe in the intelligence services. They've decided that the masses should not be exposed to the material that the party has to offer. And on that level, that's a sign of a positive move, because if they're worried about the material that we're putting out, it's only because they know very well that it will connect and make sense to an increasing number of workers across the country. So I went on rather longer there than I expected to, but that acts as a preamble. So Let's now pause and go through the expressions of greetings to those who are in the chat so far. So Arnold, good evening to you down there in Bridlington. Tobias, good evening. Jerry, good evening to you down in there in Hampshire. Peter in Perfidious Albion, as always, good evening to you. And Lee, who's been enjoying the shows recently, glad you have been doing so, comrade. Carmo, good evening to you. President Jesus, who joins us all the way from Los Angeles, California, under the tyranny of American psycho Newsom, possible future president. Good evening to Irish Partisan, who says, glory to the Palestinian Yemeni resistance. And that is entirely correct sentiment. Irish Partisan, our comrade out there in Minsk. And hello to Klavek, and good evening to Jay out in Norfolk, Virginia. And greetings to CJ, who's in Richmond, also Virginia, unless my geography is out of whack. Gordon Fiala says, Holodomor was the French, Greeks, and Poles waging a literal war with Polish espionage and Russian aristocratic coups, but Putin blames Stalin for the food shortages. He is a capitalist. All of which is absolutely correct, by the way. Gordon is entirely right in what he says there. And he follows up with saying, I'm a Kievan, Canadian. So you're from Kiev originally and you're in Canada and you're a communist. Well, solidarity, comrade. What he says there, our commenter Gordon there about the Holodomor is completely correct. Putin, following along from Yeltsin and other anti-communist rulers, blamed Stalin for it, but in actual fact, as research done by the American academic Mark Tauger has confirmed, the communists didn't cause the famine in Ukraine. It was a famine also, by the way, due to a crop failure across a wider area other than just Ukraine. And it was a regular occurrence, at least once or twice a decade in Russian history, going back way into the previous century, the 19th century, that there would be these catastrophic crop failures and famines. And that was the last one that was that bad inside the Soviet Union. There were problems immediately after World War II, due to the amount of destruction that the Nazis had inflicted on the Soviet agricultural system. But the collectivization, which of course the anti-communists, including Putin, blame for the famine in Ukraine, was actually the answer to those regular crop failures. And it only started to fail, of course, when Gorbachev dismantled the collective farm system, or tried to, in the 1980s. So, yeah, and this is, by the way, talking of repression, I should mention the case of Sergei Udaltsov, who's a leader of the Russian left front and a frequent collaborator with the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. He has been arrested recently, just in the last week, by the Russian authorities and charged with terrorism, in just the same way my own comrades have today. This, of course, is a ludicrous charge. Udaltsov supports the Russian special military operation, is a Marxist-Leninist in the best traditions of Russia, is no comprador, and is no Navalnyist. He has been arrested for similar reasons to my own comrades, I suspect, which is that, again, we have to take into account the mixed nature of the Russian state. On some levels, the Putin system is a form of progressive Bonapartism. On some other levels, it is still a system which has as one of its constituent groups the Russian capitalist class, who have not changed their character. And they can't change their character because the restoration of capitalism in Russia came at a time when capitalism's usefulness to humanity had already gone. It had already been superseded. And so the restoration of capitalism in the Russian Federation, as it became, and the rest of the Soviet Union when it fell apart, was a true counter-revolution in the sense that it restored a lower form of production. And with the lower form of production came all the social horrors that went along with it. Putin's system has restored order and has gone in some positive directions. It would be foolish to deny that. But, and I will emphasize this again, it cannot complete the process of recovery in Russia, because the only thing that can truly restore the Russian nation is not the power of the proletariat and the infinite creativity that the masses and the power of the masses have within them and at their disposal. The creativity and energy of the masses is the only thing that can restore a nation. That is one of Mao's great insights. It's one of Kim Il-sung's great insights. It's one of the cornerstones of what the Juche philosophy, which, by the way, just as a side note, is an extension of Marxist-Leninism. The Koreans always insist that it is, and they are correct. But only that can truly restore a nation. So, for instance, the KPRF, Communist Party of the Russian Federation, were talking about the decline in the Russian birth rate. Like, the Russian population is now back to the level that it was in the late 19th century, in the Tsarist period. That's a social catastrophe that has been overseen by the restoration of capitalism in Russia. So the only thing that can truly restore the birth rate is not just to do with financial incentives or any of the myriad of other things that the Putin government is trying to put out there. It's the knowledge that the masses have that they are the masters of the nation. That's the biggest and most significant single factor behind the collapse of birth rates in countries where capitalism has been restored. People feel alienated and powerless on top of being increasingly impoverished. That's the reason why birth rates in Russia collapsed. And only the return to power of the proletarian masses in Russia will solve the problems that still plague it. Right. Will Johnson, good evening to you. And good afternoon, says Martin, over there in the United States. Heidi, good evening to you. Where are we now? Jay Londonono says, evening Tovarishi, which, of course, means comrades in Russian. Terry, good evening to you, my comrade from the Class Consciousness Project. And good evening to Burke. Jerry says, I saw the stall had been surrounded but didn't know there were arrests. Yeah, apparently there are. Yuan says, apparently Caesar law is not terrorism, which is the Caesar sanctions, I believe you're referring to there. So Yuan, which is, of course, the system of essentially being able to create a state of siege around a country that the US imperialists rely on. Yeah, well, it's not terrorism if they do it. Remember, the bourgeoisie still see themselves as the universal subjects. So they are the subjects of history. They are the ones who make the wheels move as they see it. And therefore, everything they do, by definition, is good. Everything we do, by definition, against them is horrible, awful, criminal, terroristic. They haven't changed their messaging in 200 years, you know. Everything they do to further their own class interests is divine justice or taking the human race forward or whatever justification you want to use. Everything the working class does is a horror. This is, again, the messaging never changes. Good afternoon, says Vanilla Gorilla from South Carolina. Well, good to see you here. Good evening, says Red Star Betty from Durham. And hello to Lisa. Martin says, also Fred Mosley and Ian Wright. I think those guys are Trotskyists, and that just why is an interesting question, but I think their work on Marx's Free Laws of Capitalist Motion is valuable. Haven't read Mosley and Wright, I must admit. They're probably sitting in the vast pile of literature I have to get through on that. Yu Wan says 9/11 was one way of diverting tax dollars, i.e. an attack on the working class. Certainly the aftermath was. Many attacks on the working class were carried through whilst the entire media and cultural sphere was focused on the terrorism scare. Lisa is in Massachusetts, USA. Good evening to you out over there. Or is it still afternoon there? Martin says victory to the resistance. Peter says, Lacan portrays the superego as an agency that relishes in breaking the official law in the name of upholding it. Masses of petty, easy-to-violate punitive laws assist it, i.e. the West today. Interesting point. Jacques Lacan, an interesting figure. Maybe we should do a program on him someday. I've only read a couple of things of his, including the Purloined Letter, which was interesting, but I'll have to go back and read it again before I comment on it. Gordon says, Russia won't have an army without a proletariat. The West used 6 billion slaves to get their proletariat as fascist as possible. Russia needs to build its nation. Music, movies, science, recreation, culture, monuments, places the rich can travel to do things even. It takes populace to prosper. Right. Let's then move to our next item of discussion then. And that is, of course, the situation in Ecuador. Now, if you're not familiar with what happened here, this broke out last week and was took the form of a series of violent incidents that included the storming of a TV station by a group of armed men who made some news presenter read out a list of demands with a pump-action shotgun pointed at his neck, which would cause you to probably fuck up your reading of your lines off the auto cue. And also included the prison break of a couple of major drug dealers. And for a few hours, it looked like the Ecuadorian state was almost on the point of imploding. It didn't in the end. The new president, this clown who we'll come to later, declared a state of emergency. It looks like the state forces managed to get something of a handle on it, but there's still a lot of chaos. There's still a lot of violence going on, it seems. And this leads to the question of well, what exactly is going on in Ecuador. Now, if you're not familiar with who the president of Ecuador is, he's this guy in his 30s called Daniel Noboa. Now, he is the third president in a row who's come from the Ecuadorian ruling class, or who's been a servant of the Ecuadorian ruling class. So after Rafael Correa, the leftist coalition leader president, who oversaw a series of social improvements in Ecuador that were important but by no means revolutionary, I would say. He departed and then was followed by his hand-picked successor, a guy ironically entitled Lenin Moreno. Now, Moreno was supposed to be a sort of a continuity candidate from Correa. He immediately, though, or very soon after coming to power, made it clear that he was actually a stooge of imperialism. He's the one who, of course, set up the removal of Julian Assange from the Ecuadorian embassy in London, but also he started the process of dismantling the progressive social and economic reforms that Correa had pursued. And a key way in which he did this was, of course, crippling Ecuador with a gigantic amount of debt. Now, Ecuador, if you've read things like Confessions of an Economic Hitman by a guy called John Perkins, it's a very interesting book that I read many years ago now. That deals a lot with the activities of companies like Exxon and Chevron in Ecuador. If you're familiar with the case of a guy called Stephen Donziger, I mean, he's been essentially subject to a private prosecution by Chevron and has been under house arrest in the United States, or was under house arrest for many months due to this private prosecution brought by Chevron. So Ecuador as a country has been subjected to the control of US imperialism for many, many decades. Some of the most important imperialist companies, such as, of course, the oil companies, operate there. And so Correa getting himself into office there, winning a couple of elections, was a significant moment. Some put it down to the fact that the US imperialists in the early 2000s were so invested in the disaster that they had created in Iraq, they took their eye off the ball when it comes to South America. I mean, that's partly the case. But he also had significant movements of the South American masses, especially in Venezuela and Bolivia. Correa, of course, was a less radical leader, I would say, than certainly Chavez or Maduro or Morales. And I think that the way in which you can trace why is by examining the role of the masses in each of these countries. See, in, of course, Venezuela, initially, Chavez gets elected as part of a coalition of parties, which includes some broadly liberal parties. Essentially, he wasn't that radical originally in 1999 when he first gets into power. However, the attempt to remove him via a very crude and botched coup was defeated by a huge uprising of the Venezuelan working class. And from that moment on, Chavez was pushed forward in terms of his policies. He became more radical because the role of the masses in the Bolivarian revolution increased. And you have in Venezuela an undeniable ongoing revolutionary process because you have a situation where the working class has established a system of complementary power, or maybe not dual power, but a system of working class councils has emerged across the neighborhoods of the major cities and towns in Venezuela, where workers participate directly in the governing of their particular neighborhood. And this is supported by the state through the office of the president, through the constituent assembly, etc. So there you have the masses directly involved in a revolutionary process. And it's an ongoing battle, a push and pull battle with the Venezuelan bourgeois, because of course they're still there. Now eventually they're going to have to be fully dispossessed. Now that may come sooner, that may come later, but the survival of the Bolivarian revolution up to this point is because Chavez recognized, and Maduro has recognized, that the way in which that this will last is if the masses are organized and mobilized. And again, because I've been reading a fair amount of the work of Kim Il-sung recently, I will go back to something that he said, which is that you need to essentially, he's talking about cadre organization, you need to have as he put it, a hardcore in every organization of the working class. So you need to have an incredibly motivated and solid cadre in the Workers' Party of Korea in his case, or in the PSUV, and other supporting parties and agencies in Venezuela. You need to have a hardcore motivated cadre in like workers' organizations. You need it in everywhere you possibly can, because the more of these people, what Gramsci called permanent persuaders, that you have, the more chance you have of keeping that most precious of commodities that we were referring to right at the top of the program, which is the unity of the working class. The more of these capable cadre that you have, the permanent persuaders, the more chance you have of your revolutionary process surviving and prospering. And this is what they had in, of course, Venezuela. It's what they had in Bolivia. It's why in Bolivia, even though they successfully couped out Morales, and I think caught the masses by surprise, it's why there was a well-organized resistance movement to the Janine Áñez coup government, and why that government ultimately had to concede new elections and lost them. And also it's why Morales will probably ultimately return to power, having been, I think, judging from the statements that he makes on his Twitter account, it seems that he has actually been radicalized by the process of being removed from power and having to flee out of the country for a little while at least. Otherwise he faced arrest and possible murder. Now Correa, in comparison, did some of those things, but the role of the masses was much less in Ecuador than it was in either Venezuela, Bolivia, or Nicaragua, where of course the Sandinistas have been organizing the masses even when they were out of power for many, many years. And it's why, of course, the Sandinistas survived the attempt to remove them in 2018. So Correaism didn't have enough of that, which is why Moreno, the chosen successor, it was far more conventional reformist, much more top-down than either Venezuela or Bolivia or Nicaragua has been. And it's why Moreno was able to dismantle this so easily, relatively easily. It's why, of course, he takes the loan from the International Monetary Fund. The same way, by the way, that Mauricio Macri did in Argentina. The reason why these are offered to certain countries is because the more they can plunge them, i.e. the imperialists can plunge them into debt, the more control you can exercise over them. And so you plunge the country into debt. This is all a very well-structured plan, by the way. You plunge the country into debt. You make sure that the forces of the traditional oligarchy are supported in every way you possibly can. This, by the way, will have been something that Elliot Abrams and people like that will work on. And then you tell the chosen representatives of the oligarchy, Moreno or his successor Guillermo Lasso, who I think was a banker, and now Noboa, who's the son of one of the biggest oligarchs who I believe is involved in banana plantations. His father is. The guy's in his 30s and has had most of his higher level education in the United States. He's a complete stooge of US imperialism. And you have crippled Ecuador with a giant amount of debt. You have destroyed most of the programs that Correa put in place in the name of paying off that debt, which Moreno, without real cause, placed upon the country. And so what you have now is that you have a poverty rate of at least 27% people of the Ecuadorian population living in poverty. You have 11% of the population living in what's classified by the United Nations as extreme poverty. Now, according to official government statistics, the unemployment rate is only 4%. I believe that that's probably higher, but even if we take that lower figure, what you find now, and you find this in the imperialist countries as well, is that there's a gigantic amount of so-called in-work poverty. And that's undoubtedly what's been going on also in Ecuador. You also have a lot of migration out of the country, and most reporting, even of the fairly bourgeois variety that's being in any way accurate, will tell you that there is a pervasive despair and degeneration in the society. And here we come to the point about why criminal gangs gain confidence to the point of staging armed insurrectionary incidents, which is what they did the other day, doing prison breaks and stuff like that. And they, of course, it comes from the fact that as various supporters of Correa have stated beforehand, that the various regimes of Moreno and Lasso and now Noboa is barely in the office yet, but Guillermo Lasso and Moreno, essentially they're alleging that they dismantled the power of the state and the ability of the state to actually intervene against the armed gangs. And that might be part of it, I don't doubt that, but it doesn't explain the popularity of the armed gangs. So what I think, and again, this is purely my own interpretation, has been going on, not just in Ecuador, but you can extend this analysis to many other countries where you get this kind of problem, is that when you get this unholy and toxic combination of factors, you get not only increased poverty, but you also get the pervasive sense of not just hopelessness, but also nihilism that breeds from that. See, when Marx refers to the lumpen in the Communist Manifesto, he's talking about them as a tool of reaction, as an enemy of the working class. Now, what does he mean by this? The lumpen, i.e., Marx defines as these sort of semi-proletarian but increasingly criminal elements that are the enemy of the worker, and they're the enemy of the worker because they're tools of reaction. And organized crime is a tool of reaction, and always has been. And of course, organized crime in its current form comes about in the period of mass urbanization, because of course it responds to and is a product of the conditions of modern capitalism. So organized crime grows and it becomes particularly popular. Why? Now, and of course, the answer to this question is it also contains why capitalism cannot solve this issue. So when you get not just pervasive poverty, but also societal disintegration and hopelessness, meaning there's no working class organization that can promote solidarity, mutual aid between people and communities, and can promote and retain the sense of class unity, community cohesion and spirit that is needed to withstand the attacks of the ruling class. And if that's not there, when you get that increasing poverty and increasing desperation an increasing atomization, alienation, and all the other social ills that come with a capitalism that is declining and falling apart, then you also get the situation in Latin America with the extremely large number of drug cartels you have around. And you have cultural problems, such as, again, in Western culture in particular, the glamorization of the gangster, or the fact that in some communities it is only those who are tied to organized crime who actually manage to make any money, who actually appear to present a way out of the poverty trap and the hopelessness that comes about in declining capitalism. So this is, of course, part of the reason, I think, why people join various different gangs. There's also the socialization aspect. Once somebody is socialized, often by engaging in extremely violent acts to not just make them guilty, but to bind them more effectively to each other. If you engage in some kind of horrific act of criminality or violence with a group of other gang members, you are bound to each other by collective and shared guilt. And of course, socialization counts for an awful lot. People work with and live with other people, other members of a particular criminal organization. They start to develop ties and loyalty to them, group loyalty, in the same way that exists in more positive sets of circumstances. So this is, I think, part of the reason why organized crime starts to grow in these circumstances. It is only partly to do with extreme poverty, though this is, of course, is a big factor. It's also to do with alienation. It's also to do with, again, a lack of hope in anything getting better in any other way. And also, of course, the idea that the gangster way, the way of robbery and the way of violence, is a way of actually getting yourself and perhaps your immediate family out of the mess that you are undoubtedly in. And for all these reasons, people get involved in organized crime. Of course, it never leads, for most of them, to anything other than a long prison sentence or death, either at the hands of each other, ultimately, when these gangs fall apart and turn on each other, or the state, or some combination of the two. Now, what relationship does this have with the capitalist state? Now, the capitalist state has an interesting relationship with organized crime, especially the most powerful capitalist states like the United States, Britain, France, etc. At various different points, the capitalists are more than happy to have the working class communities flooded with narcotics, or back in the day alcohol, or any substance that will help anesthetize the working class, particularly when the capitalist system is in trouble. And so to that end, at certain points, they're quite happy. Again, goes back to what I was saying earlier about the ruling class turning to various different solutions, short-term solutions to the problems generated by the contradictions of capitalism. They turn to organized crime sometimes to break working class unity, sometimes directly by employing gangsterist organizations to commit violence against working class organizations. Sometimes it's slightly more subtle by collaborating with organized crime to flood areas with drugs, to flood them with various other substances, shall we say, encouraging or turning a blind eye to criminal gangs running things like drug operations or sex trafficking operations. Often there is a close relationship and collaboration between the intelligence agencies of the most powerful imperialist countries and the various different organized crime operations. The collaboration between, of course, the Central Intelligence Agency and the drug cartels of South America is very well documented, of course. As we mentioned on a program a number of weeks ago, the very well documented and admitted to collaboration between the CIA and the drug runners who are working with the Contras in Nicaragua to sell cocaine on the streets of Los Angeles, that of course helped fuel the crack wars of the 1980s. That's now admitted to even by the CIA themselves. And so, well, what do you think they're doing now? And also look at the fact that on the edges of the empire, on the edges of US imperialist control, in some of the places where they've actually got the most direct control, like Kosovo, like Ukraine, like Israel, what happens? Various aspects of organized crime mushroom. They grow there like crazy. So what you have in Ukraine, well, you have everything there: weapon smuggling, drug smuggling, sex trafficking, organ harvesting. All the worst and most debased things you can possibly find are there. Same in Kosovo. Even bourgeois journalists note that it's an absolute haven for gun running, drug running, cigarette smuggling, and of course the trafficking of women. Where do those women go? Well, a lot of them go to Israel. Israel is acknowledged even by the Israeli press, the Zionist press themselves, as being a center for, again, sex trafficking, drug running, weapon smuggling, arms dealing, both legal and illegal. And this is what the system creates in a lot of its most reliable vassals. And it shouldn't come as a surprise to us. This is, again, to go back to the old story of the base and the superstructure. It arises out of the base in most of these vassal states. That's what happens. When a nation is subjugated under the most parasitic elements possible, i.e. the local comprador oligarchy, when its productive base is destroyed or completely subordinated to imperialism, when its population has been atomized and all collective organization of the working class has been smashed. Again, what happens in places like those most obvious vassals I just mentioned, like Ukraine, Kosovo, Israel, same is true in places that have been overcome by US-aligned coups. Because what happened with Moreno, who overturned a lot of what Correa did, that was essentially a coup. The man ran as a fraud. He was already, according to some reports, already compromised by US imperialism. He was always going to overturn what Correa did, but of course ran as the continuity candidate. And without enough working class power present, it was hard to stop him. So now all of this has come about as a result of the activities of US imperialism. And it is not possible for the comprador bourgeoisie to solve this issue. They may be able to repress this using the power of the state for a few months, a few years. Then, of course, it will return again because, again, this is generated by the nature of the Ecuadorian social and economic setup that the comprador oligarchy has created. They have created a system whereby there is an increasing amount of lumpenization in the most poverty-stricken elements. And therefore, it is creating a situation where organized crime is going to thrive. And I think for a while at least, they're quite happy for it to thrive, because now what they're going to do is they're going to rapidly increase the amount of military so-called aid that the US imperialists give to Ecuador. So Noboa, being a chosen man, a pure creation of US imperialism, educated in the US imperialist finishing schools of the Ivy League University, I believe, that he went to inside the United States. He is a complete product of theirs. He's clearly a project of the State Department and the CIA. He will now, we're already seeing US aid commit to vastly increasing its budget for Ecuador. We'll see a package of assistance to Ecuador to restore law and order coming soon from the Pentagon, if it's not happened already. They'll express a statement of concern about the rule of law in Ecuador. They'll probably do a meeting where Tony Blinken grips Noboa's hand and grins and gets him to fully support Israel, whilst committing to aiding the Ecuadorian government in restoring order and restoring the civil order, all the buzzwords they come out with. What it actually will be about is making sure that the security forces are rebuilt from the top down in the image wanted by US imperialism. I mean, this will have happened to a large degree already, but this is a big opportunity for US imperialism to step in and tell Noboa, right, we're going to reorganize your state forces, we're going to reorganize your domestic intelligence agencies. Don't worry, we'll help you restore order. What will it actually be about? It'll be about making sure that the US imperialists have complete control of all of these agencies, that they have reliable men in place to make sure that their orders are carried out, and that they have a training system in place whereby they get the officer corps of the militarized police, the intelligence agencies, and the military to go to the United States for some good old-fashioned American training in anti-gang warfare. And this is what will happen. Now, I said a while ago that the US imperialists will be looking for every single opportunity to make sure that they now can stop any growth towards socialism in Latin America. And so when an eruption happens like this, they are already all over this. And Noboa will accept everything that they tell him, which is why he's there. So the micro here, the micro level, is about this explosion of gang violence in Ecuador. The macro level, the zoom out picture, shall we say, is that this is an incident that will be used by the US imperialists to make sure that their control over the machinery of the Ecuadorian state is absolutely solidified. And they may, in the process of this, go after and kill a number of these big name Ecuadorian drug barons. There'll probably be loads of arrests. You know how the imperialists behave. They'll want to show that they've done something. They'll want to restore confidence. They'll want to make sure that Noboa's presidency is seen as having restored order. But of course, as with everything they do, it'll continue to generate more gang violence because the biggest problem is the pervasive sense of alienation, despair, and hopelessness in Ecuadorian society, that there is no way forward for it. And the only way that you can counteract that, the only way you can bury organized crime for good, is, of course, the unity of the proletariat, the unity of the Ecuadorian masses in the fight for socialism. That is the only way to fully overcome the antagonisms that create organized crime and lead to these situations. So, that brings us to the end of what I wanted to say tonight. I will just now catch up with the comments. Let's just have a look through here now. Right. Good evening to Stanislav from Sofia, Bulgaria. Well, good to have a Bulgarian comrade on the line. Very interesting events in the east of Europe at the moment, including in Bulgaria, with the flailings of the domestic compradors to show their loyalty to the US hegemon. President Jesus says, was it the president of Ecuador or Panama who mysteriously died in a plane crash? I get my CIA regime changes confused. I think it might have been Panama. I'm not sure. I'll have to come back to that. Lisa says, easily manipulated, I think in reference to the Lumpens. Yep. Martin says, J. Edgar Hoover famously denied that organised crime existed. I wonder why. Because he was working with them. I mean, organised crime, when in the good old days of the early FBI, was a key part of J. Edgar Hoover's repressive apparatus, which was particularly aimed at communists. The organised crime has always been an ally of capitalist governments, especially the imperialists. They know very well the usage of how organised crime can be used very effectively to terrorize and to divide the working class. Jerry says, Ecuador's cloud forest nature reserves with thousands of unique species of flora and fauna. Corporations are trying to mine the shit out of the place. Yes, they have been for a long time. Red Star Betty says, yes, it's a beautiful country, and like Jamaica is being mined by corporations who don't clean up after themselves. Yep, they never do. Where did all those Syrian refugees the Czechs dejected into Ukraine go? I don't know. I hadn't heard of that. Crime in Ecuador, an opportunity for imperialism similar to terrorism in the Sahel, says Martin. And that is exactly the right way of viewing it. We've talked before about the Sahel and the way in which they exploited the rise of jihadist organizations, or in the case of Mali, a sort of regionalist movement combined with a jihadist organization. Yeah, ultimately, it is the contradictions of the imperialist system which generate a lot of these problems. Or sometimes, the book's yet to be written on the exact role that imperialism plays in the Sahel, but my guess is that they are at least somewhat behind some of these organizations in terms of provision of arms, etc. We know that they were providing arms to, for instance, both Al-Qaeda and all its variants in Syria and ISIS as well, and that the Turks were trading with ISIS in terms of oil, etc. So the relationship with organized crime, I think, is similar to Martin's point is correct, to the relationship the imperialists have with various different Salafist organizations. Sometimes they attack each other. More often than not, they're working together one way or the other. Red Star Betty says, Cuba was an organized crime paradise under Batista. Yes, and they're still angry about losing it. Right, okay, comrades. I will leave my comments there for today. It's been a very interesting stream tonight. I hope that you have got something out of it. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't already, and the edited audio will be up on Patreon later today. I'll be back again with you tomorrow. Until then, I will say good night and solidarity to you all.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاش الجيل الصاعد،
عاش
جيل من شعب مجاهد، عاش يبني ويجاهد، عاش بكفاحه الخالد، عاش يبني ويجاهد، عاش بكفاحه الخالد، راجل واحد مبدأ واحد،
عاش جيل ثورتنا عاش.
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد حرار. عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار، كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد حرار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية،
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية.
أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. أنا خط هجوم ودفاع، أنا رمز سلام وصراع، أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا،
عاش الجندي العربي عاش.
عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عينيه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عينيه، فرشت نورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها قوية، أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية، أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين، وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا،
عاش فلاح الثورة